Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BuzzStream Podcast. I'm your host, Vince Nero. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Amanda Walls, the founder and director of Cedarwood Digital. How you doing, Amanda?
Hey, Vince. I'm doing really good, thanks. It's Friday, so it's the end of the week. So I am, over the moon, ready for the weekend.
Yeah, I think we all are. My kid has been sick at home all week, so he just went back to school today, which is awesome. And I'm pumped to be able to record a podcast after that little quarantine.
I can imagine.
Thanks so much for joining us, Amanda. We got to talk a bit at Brighton. We were on a panel. You ran digital PR and content marketing panel. It was a great panel. We had some great discussion points. And I realized, which I didn't before, that you said that you started as a journalist. And if anyone's listened to this podcast or watched the podcast, I love that. I love kind of digging into that. And so that's kind of what we are going to talk about today. Before we get into it, I do want to remind everyone to like and subscribe. The more that we can share this stuff and get exposure on the BuzzStream podcast, the more we can have great guests like Amanda on. So like I said, you moved from journalism into marketing, but what I didn't also realize, and should have maybe your accent, you actually started in Australia. You moved to the UK from Australia, and that's kind of where you got into journalism. So let's start there. Tell us a little bit about your path, and then I'm going to start digging into the things that we can learn from it, because I think that's all really interesting and important stuff for digital PRs to understand.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Australia. I was from Melbourne originally. So I grew up there. I did school. I did university. And then at my school, I think I went through that stage a lot of people go through where I didn't know what I wanted to do. So in Australia, what you do when you finish school is you put down kind of 8 course topics that you want. And mine couldn't have been more varied. So I had like a journalism one, I had economics, I had commerce engineering, I had straight engineering, I had just like a general arts degree. I kind of put them all down. And I remember when I looked at them, I was like, wow, I'm a really confused person right now. I don't know. So I could have ended up as anything. I could have ended up as like an engineer. I could have ended up as like an economist. I could have ended up in any way. But I got an offer from, one of the first offers I got was from a journalism university in Australia called RMIT, which is based in Melbourne. And I took the offer. It was a really great opportunity because there's only 45 people in my course. So I thought it was really good. It's kind of hands-on. We do a lot of filming. There's the opportunity to do radio journalism. There's really good kind of internships at TV and print in Australia, kind of good places. So I did that for 3 years and I covered everything from print to broadcast to things like communications law. I also did German as well in there as my electives because I wanted to branch out into languages. I'd done French and Chinese at school, so I wanted to also do something else. So I did that for 3 years. I had a lot of fun. It was university. Everyone has a lot of fun at uni. And I came out with a journalism degree and I started to put it into practice. So throughout my degree, I'd done a couple of different things. So I'd gone to kind of rural. So in Australia, when you're a journalist, what traditionally happens is you kind of go and do a year or two in like the outback. I mean, not like the outback that you see on like films, but say rural Australia. So like an hour and a half, 2 hours out of the city centre. You work the kind of rural round and then you move back to the city centre. And I really didn't want to do that because I didn't want to have 2 years away from my friends. So I actually took a role working with V8 Supercars in Australia, which is, people ask me what it is, and I say it's like Formula One, but it's really not like Formula One. Like it's not got the prestige of Formula One or anything like that. And I immediately think, actually, maybe it's not, but it's basically, it's just like big cars that race around. But in Australia, it's a national series and you have like 12 rounds and they go to all different cities. And I had the pleasure of doing some trackside reporting there. So I went into the garages and I interviewed the drivers and I loved it because I was big into Formula One. So I was like, oh, this is cool. I could have a career in this as a journalist. And at the same time, I also worked for a local government publication in Melbourne, where I was responsible for kind of sourcing stories for the publication, particularly around what was impacting like local councils. So really enjoyed that. I liaised with a lot of PRs to kind of send me information for that. I also liaised with a lot of PRs, in the motorsport space as well. So, I really enjoyed that and did all of that. And then I actually went back to university. I did a master's in global communications, so a sort of a broader degree. And in that degree, I started to get exposed to digital marketing. And it was something that in Australia wasn't really talked about at that time. So I think Australia is still a little way behind in terms of the online space. We're not really set up for e-commerce just due to logistics. We're not, we're very much like in-person kind of people. We're not really like a home delivery service. I think Australia is built on relationships. It's the way that people kind of are. So I don't think it naturally lent itself to that. But I started to learn about it, started to learn about things like social media, and I became really interested in it. And at the end of my master's, I decided that, and I kind of looked at the journalism space in Australia, and it was around the time where journalists were starting to get replaced by social media or like citizen reporters. So to put that into context, when I was at university, I didn't have Facebook, so that's how old I am. So social media wasn't really a thing. When I was growing up, when I was at school, when I was at the start of university, when I was doing journalism, social media didn't play a role in that. But when I left my first degree, that's when it really started to take off. So we'd gone through our kind of MySpace era, and we moved into Facebook, and we're getting kind of Twitter and those kind of platforms. And at that time as well, journalism changed a lot. So it changed from being really heavily reliant on reporters to the fact that everyone had a phone which they could take a picture of. Because I also at school didn't have a phone that had a camera. I had like a Nokia 3310. I could play Snake on it. That's about all it did. So I didn't have the opportunity to take pictures. But now all of a sudden we had, a whole host of citizen journalists who would be on the scene first, and we'd be there taking pictures and reporting on what was happening, whether it was true or not, sort of, you don't really know at that point. But it alleviated a lot of the things that journalists did. And what we found then in the Australian market was that journalists started to get squeezed. There became less jobs. And at that point, I made the decision to move to marketing. It's a really long-winded story, by the way. Sorry about that. But then I sort of looked around and I was like, right, Australia's not it. I also wanted to do some traveling. So I then moved to Singapore, where I traveled around Asia for a while, spent quite a lot of time in Thailand and Indonesia. Singapore was starting to get the uptake for digital marketing. So sort of had a chat to a lot of people there, picked it up, and then decided that the UK was the place to go. So I moved back to the UK in 2012, and I basically made the transition then from journalism into PR. So initially I did apply to work at the BBC. So I wanted to do the Formula One coverage, but it was pretty sewn up. It was a really difficult space to get into. And I just didn't have much chance of getting that role. So a role came up at an SEO agency. I didn't actually know what SEO was then, but I was like, this looks cool. And it was a content and PR based role. So I took that role, and that was kind of how I started, I guess. And I spent 7 years at that agency before I moved to Cedarwood. But I actually applied for that job on Gumtree. Strange story. And I nearly didn't get it because the response to it went into my junk mail. So I nearly didn't get into marketing because, that happened. And then I went for the interview, and I had a load of disasters on the way to the interview. I split the leggings that I was wearing, and I basically arrived looking like I'd been dragged through a bush backwards. But I got the job in the end, and that's why I'm here today.
And here we are. Wow. Yeah, what a journey. I love it. You said a handful of things in there. One of the things that was really interesting to me was this idea of in Australia, you said kind of do rural coverage first before getting into kind of more city metropolitan stuff. Why is that? What's the, just to kind of, is it easier, more slow, slower pace?
So it's actually way more difficult in a lot of instances. So basically all of the major, so in Australia, we have like 4 major TV stations, let's say. We have ABC, which is like the BBC, we have Channel 7, Channel 9, and Channel 10. I don't know why they're those numbers. It's not very logical, but that's kind of how we are. And each one of those has a regional subsidiary. And it's the same with the newspapers. Again, each one of those has a regional subsidiary. So the theory is that they send the journalists out to the regions. You learn, you work really, really hard. So it's long days. You're covering rural stories, which don't have generally kind of really high readership, but it's designed to hone your skills so that when you come back to the city centre and you're in the city centre newsrooms, whether it be for, Channel 9, Channel 10, or like the Herald Sun, the Age, the sort of major daily newspapers, you're right there and ready to kind of get up with that pace. Like you're ready, you're kind of trained, you've done your so I guess it's almost like an internship, right? You've done like a year, 2 years where you've been trained and you know exactly how everything works. And then you're ready to go straight into the newsrooms. Because I did an internship at Win TV, which is like the regional version of Channel 9. And then I did an internship at Channel 9 itself. And at Win, you were driving around, you had to kind of sign in a videographer to go with you. And then you had to edit a lot of the content yourself. then you go into the city centre, and instead of doing one story a day, you're doing 2 stories a day. Instead of sourcing your own news, you're being given news, and you have like a video editor. But because you already know how to do that, you kind of learn that regionally, it's easy for you to kind of mark the bits you want to pull out. So I think a lot of it is that it's a training ground, that works really well. It's more so in TV. So my specialism was TV journalism at that point. In print, you can do like a local newspaper, and there's a lot of those kind of in Melbourne. So you can kind of stay in Melbourne for that if you want. But it's still, again, you would get your training at like the community newspapers, we call them Leader in Melbourne. And then you would apply to like the Herald Sun or the Age with a portfolio of stuff you've done at a regional level. It's kind of how it's always been.
Is that similar in UK journalism, where there's kind of, you have to cut your teeth in kind of more like a internship type role where you're really learning things before you can get into like the major newsroom?
I think to a point. I think in the UK, you've probably got more opportunities to get into bigger newsrooms as well, because there's more of an online news space. Whereas in Australia, the online news space, again, isn't as popular because traditionally we've always done things in person. So you're kind of competing for less spots. Like there's only three major TV channels. There's only 2 major newspapers, let's say, whereas here in the UK, you've got 5 or 6. So naturally there's less jobs. So you kind of really need to refine your skill before you go into it. Like here in the UK, you can still do the same thing. You can still work at the kind of, like the JPI Medias, the Reach PLCs, the local publications here. But I think a lot of it, you get a lot more freelancers here. So a lot of the major publications tend to work more with freelancers, whereas in Australia, we wouldn't really use freelancers much at all. It would always be people that are employed directly by the kind of publication.
Let's continue your journey here to why you started Cedarwood. You worked in an agency and then you decided to start your own. What made you make that jump?
So I'd spent nearly 7 years at the agency that I worked at, and I got to a point, which I think a lot of people get to, where I kind of felt like I was doing a lot of work for someone else and I wasn't really getting a lot out of it. I didn't feel like I could progress anymore. I was the head of digital. I'd kind of hit the ceiling. I was managing a lot of what happened in the agency. So the structure of the agency at that point, when I started, there was kind of 4 owners of the agency, which is a lot of owners anyway. When I left, there was 2. The agency was full service, so we did web design, web development, and digital marketing, which encompassed SEO, PPC, PR, etc. When I left, there was me, and I was managing the whole digital marketing. There was another owner who did design and another owner who did development. So I sort of felt like I was managing a very lucrative part of the business, but I wasn't an owner. I wasn't ever going to be an owner. I wasn't ever really going to be a director. So it was just kind of my time to move on. I also felt like I wanted to move away from full service, and I wanted to use more of my skill set in an agency. So when I started Cedarwood, it was very much with the premise we were only ever going to do SEO, PR, traditional and digital, and paid media. So that's paid social and PPC. We were never going to do organic social. We were never going to do email. We weren't going to do design or development. We didn't want to focus on any of those things. It was purely to focus on where my skill set was. And I think one of the reasons that I did that again was because if I had this fear that, let's say, for example, we did design and development and something went wrong with the website and someone came to me, I would have no idea how to sort it out. I would just be like, I don't know how I'm going to help you with that. Whereas with SEO and paid media and digital PR, there were all things I could do. So, if worse came to worse, and this doesn't really happen, but let's say from an owner's perspective, it's something that you want to have confidence you can do, I could help out. So it got to the point where I just decided, right, I'm going to start Cedarwood. So I sort of went off and I started it, and I originally started it as freelance role. So I'd done a lot of traveling, and I wanted to do a lot more. I had a lot of parts of Asia in particular that I hadn't explored. So I thought, well, you know what, I'll do a couple of years freelance and then I'll see what happens. And within a year of freelancing, it got really busy. So I just got a lot of inquiries. I was kind of putting myself out a lot, got some good word of mouth referrals, got some good conversations from clients that I'd worked with previously at the agency, because the agency then kind of went into no longer offering digital marketing. So there was like a lot of there as well.
Nice, yeah.
So I guess that was kind of fortuitous maybe for me. And so I very quickly realized that I needed to take on other people to help me out. And I kind of started to hire people. And as a result of that, Cedarwood kind of became an agency. So it wasn't really planned as such. kind of
Yeah.
happened. And then I got to like 4 people and I was like, right, we're kind of an agency now. So I need to start doing agency things. Like building a website
Yeah.
would be a
Yeah.
good start.
All
So then I went
right.
and built a website, and I built an awful website on Wix. Like, not that there was nothing wrong with Wix. It was just my design skills that were terrible. And I look back on it now and I think, my goodness, that logo, what was I thinking? I'm not a designer.
I feel like most agency owners do
Oh,
that.
honestly, I'm not. You know, now we've actually had a professional designer come in and sort all of that out for us, thank goodness. But back then we
Yeah.
didn't. So it was just a website I kind of
Yeah.
put together, and then we kind of had to get an office in like a shipping container because, you know, I was trying to keep costs down, and you know, we had a very lean start. But that was when we really started to kind of, you know, build as an agency, and then that's kind of, I guess we've kind of gone on from there.
Yeah. How many people do you have now?
So we've got 14 now.
Nice. Let's get into the kind of meat of some of my questions, really stemming from your jump from as a journalist and like what you've learned into digital PR. Like, you obviously spent time as a journalist. You went to university to study communications. Do you think everyone needs this background as a journalist to succeed in digital PR?
So I don't think I would use the word need necessarily. I think need's always like a really strong word. I think anyone can do PR and don't necessarily need a journalistic background, but I do think it really helps. I think it helps you to understand what you're dealing with. Because I think often as a PR, you know, you're sort of trained to, you know, look for news ideas, pull together media lists, create campaigns, and send them to a journalist. But a lot of the time, it's really hard to understand, well, actually, how does that person on the other side of the email feel? You know, sometimes you can go, right, why have I got a really low open rate? Or why am I not getting much engagement? Why hasn't this campaign got any coverage? What is it about this particular email that a journalist might not like? And I think if you've had experience on the other side of that, then it's easier. I mean, obviously, it's not an exact science because journalists work in different ways and they work to different pressures and different timescales. But it's definitely easier to understand like what the potential issues of that might be. So I think that's definitely helped in terms of where I'm at. But then there's also other elements to it. So, for example, when you create that press release, I think it helps to know what to include because I know what I would have wanted. I know what I needed as well from a PR. And I think sometimes, you know, when I see people send things out, they sort of send out a really great story, but it's maybe missing an expert quote, or it's missing an image that needs to accompany it, or it's missing a really good graph or a really good chart that the journalist would want to kind of put in the article to make it really kind of like, you know, push home that the point that they're trying to make, or that user interest angle, or it's missing a hook. You know, at the end of the day, a lot of journalism now being online, people need clicks, they need views. So I think knowing all of that and knowing what people are actually trying to achieve is really important. And that's, you know, it's so different to having a client. You know, when we sit down with our clients initially, we talk to them about what their goals are, what they're trying to achieve. I think it's about knowing what a journalist's goals are and what they're trying to achieve. And it differs for publication, and it differs by country, and it differs by, you know, what their role is, freelance or permanent. But definitely the background helps. It's certainly not a be all and end all, but I think it helps to give that insight, which can be particularly useful if, you know, for an example, here at Cedarwood, we do something called Campaign Clinic every 2 weeks, where we look through campaigns which haven't performed as well as we'd like them to, and we kind of analyze as a team why that might have happened. And I think
I like that.
that's one area where that probably really helps, because I can say, oh, actually, do you know what, that I probably wouldn't have covered that because of this, this, and this.
What are, you know, some of the things that come out of that campaign clinic? I mean, I'm sure that probably coincides with the main things that digital PRs tend to get wrong. And you mentioned a couple of them, but what would you say is like the main issue most of the time?
I would say sometimes it's timeliness. So sometimes campaigns just take too long to get signed off, and then they've missed their hook. We did a piece last week, which was a data piece on I Miss Celeb, and then we sent it out, and literally the day we sent it out, someone else done exactly the same thing. There's not a lot that we can really do about that. But if someone else has got there first, then that's just kind of how it is. So I think that plays, you know, a really big role in it. Perhaps sometimes we'll find a gap in the research. So we'll identify that, yeah, they've been covered elsewhere, or maybe less than a year ago, less than 18 months ago. So the journalist hasn't seen it as recent. But I would say the majority of the time, what we tend to find is that it's been covered elsewhere, or the hook or the human interest angle is no longer relevant because it's past its time. That's I guess the two biggest issues that we find.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I want to get back to one of the things you said earlier, talking about like a background in journalism. There seems like it's almost like this. I feel like empathy is like too strong of a word, but like talk about like just knowing what a journalist needs, right? Like putting yourself in their shoes. One of the things that I think a lot of people get wrong, um, or maybe not even get wrong, but like it's a tough spot that you're in, right? Especially at an agency where you're trying to hit goals, you're trying to hit KPIs, you're trying to get as much coverage as possible, right? So what ends up happening is you try to scale, and you're sending emails to people that you maybe don't know. You don't know their goals. You don't know their specific uh, what they've written about specifically, unless you're taking the time to do all these checks. I guess the challenge then becomes like, right, like how do you scale, but still kind of meet that like empathy need, like hitting what the journalist knows. And to me, the way that you're talking makes it sound like maybe having that background as a journalist helps you write a better pitch, right? Like it almost is a shortcut, or it maybe safeguards and allows you to maybe send out more emails at scale without necessarily knowing every single article that your target journalist has hit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And I actually think the number of emails question is really interesting as well, because I've, we talk a lot internally about how many emails we should be sending out per campaign. What is the perfect number? And, I was at a talk a couple of weeks ago at Trust Evolve where Fergus was talking about search intelligence, and he said that they send, I think he needs number 5,000. I was like, oh my goodness, are we not sending that?
Per campaign?
Yeah.
My goodness.
People
Wow.
ran in there, and I was like, wow, that's a lot of emails. We don't send that many. And I've heard about other bigger agencies in the space saying they send the 700 to 1,000. And I understand at some point it becomes a numbers game, right? Like the law of averages is the more emails you send out, the more times you're going to get hit, but also the more times you're probably going to annoy a journalist if it's really irrelevant, and they're probably going to blacklist you. So I think that what I would say with this is that I've always had the approach that if you do your research well and you create an effective list of journalists, it doesn't have to be big. Then I think that works really well, because you know that they've covered what you're looking for. And I think they will also know that you've taken the time to understand that it's probably something that's relevant to them. I think what's frustrating for journalists is that when they're getting constantly inundated with press releases that have little to no relevance to what they cover or what their particular section is, because they're on a list of X amount of thousand journalists that hasn't been properly curated. And I'm not saying that anyone's sort of doing that, but I'm just using that as an example. I think that becomes a source of frustration. From a journalistic background perspective, I guess what I would say is that it's really easy to know what to start with on a press release when you're a journalist, because immediately I know exactly what I would want to know from this. And a lot of the time it's the hook. A lot of the time it's the, alarming statistic or the figure, the monetary figure a lot of the time, because cost of living, particularly here in the UK, is a huge topic for what's in the press. And I think, part of that comes from being a journalist, but part of that also comes from just knowing what's going on with the news and being aware of what people want to digest. And there's a lot of studies that people can look at to understand that as well. I spoke about one when I spoke at Brighton last time. I brought up a study which had said, these are the topics that people want to talk about. And it's kind of, the royals and famous people. These are the topics that people have had enough of. And it's things like Harry and Meghan, Philip Schofield. And then there was also, this is the one topic that people say they talk about most at home, and it was cost of living crisis. So even just having that information and putting that into a press release, like that kind of data, I know straight away if I've got a press release and it involves any of those things, I know what to and what to not put in it and in what order. And then I think that helps as well.
Yeah. Again, it's kind of like that shortcut to getting to know. It seems like it maybe saves research, or it saves some of those other things that I've heard, like tips like pre-pitching ideas to a journalist. It's like you kind of have that innate sense already. What about, so it sounds like the two major kind of hurdles are getting the pitch right, but then, there's this like amorphous thing of like finding the right people to reach out to, right? And there's so many different ways to do it. You can do it manually. I never worked with a with a media list, I always did it manually, and I did it through mainly looking at previous articles, but plenty of people use media lists. And so obviously, like the way I did it was very hard to scale. It took a long time, right? But when you're talking about sending 500, 5,000 emails, whatever, per campaign, I mean, you have to get smart about the way that you curate your lists. Are there things that you know from being a journalist that make it easier to curate a list? Let's start there. How do you curate your lists? And then the second part is like, what have you taken from your journalism background?
Sure. So in terms of curating a list, I think this gets easier with time because over time you start to understand what journalists want to cover, what particular topics. And sometimes it can be a little bit of trial and error at the start to get a feel for what kind of content people want to take on board. So I've been doing this for a really, really long time now. So if I have a piece of content that's going out, I immediately will have in my head kind of maybe 10 to 20 journalists that I feel like this content will be ready for. From then, going on to kind of curating a list, I'm quite active on Twitter, not so much in terms of actually tweeting, unless I'm like complaining about the trains or something like that, which is not necessarily to my credit. But I am active in digesting information from Twitter. And there's a huge amount of journalists, particularly here in the UK, that are on Twitter. And they are on Twitter with their email addresses, asking for you to send them information. And I always think the best place to start with a journalist is a journalist that wants information. Because when you're working as a journalist, you work in a number of different spaces, right? So you've got the journalists that are kind of freelance and they're being commissioned to do pieces and they need information from you and they need it quickly. You've got the journalists that are working on rounds. So they might need something, but it's very topical to that particular round, maybe like politics, business, finance, whatever that case might be. And then you have the journalists that are pre-allocated stories. So, for example, when I was working in Australia and I was at Network 10, I was often pre-allocated stories. And once I was pre-allocated to like go and interview Roger Federer, which was amazing, by the way, but I actually didn't turn the microphone on. So that was a bit of a disaster. Anyway, I enjoyed speaking to him, even though I did honestly get to report back on it. It was absolutely humiliating and I got in more trouble for it, but nevertheless. But the point that I'm trying to make is that that third journalist is someone that you don't want to target because that third journalist already has their work sorted and they don't need your pitch. And sending your pitch to them is a waste of time because they're getting their pitch from their editor and they're already covering it. And if they need more information for that pitch, they'll probably put it on Twitter and say, oh, I need a quote for this or I need a quote for that. So I think the first thing to do when you're building a media list is identify people in that first two categories. So freelancers that are commissioning pieces that need information and more general news reporters or specific round reporters that need information on particular topics. Once you've done that, you can go about building a media list. Yes, for sure, we would use a media database because that's a really great way to get that information. I also tend to use Twitter. We also spend a lot of time building our media lists. It wouldn't be unusual to spend a day to 2 days on a media list, which probably sounds like a lot of time, but it's such an important part of the outreach process. And one thing that we've spent a lot of time doing is focusing on the outreach element of digital PR. I think a lot of people, they bring this, they spend loads of time researching data and they spend loads of time putting all the data together and writing an amazing press release. And then they whip together a media list and they send it out, but they're almost like they're disadvantaging themselves at that final hurdle by not putting the extra time into, putting that list together. Whereas for us, we would spend, say, 1 to 2 days, especially if it was a bigger piece, at least, going through Twitter, pulling out the relevant details, understanding, and within our database, we will have marked and we will have tagged and labeled, which journalist falls into which of those 3 buckets. So we understand which ones are the best ones to outreach to. And then, of course, going online and researching and, scraping and understanding which, content that people have covered previously. And there's a lot of different tools that you can use to kind of pull that information together. But that's, in a nutshell, I guess, how we would do it. And where the journalism side of it comes in is really being able to identify which of those 3 buckets the journalists fall into and making sure we're just not wasting our time with bucket 3.
What are some tips you have to identify bucket 3?
Sure. So bucket 3 is probably not on Twitter. That's probably a good start because they don't need to be, because they are already kind of full in terms of their day. They don't particularly have a lot of time to spend on things like social media, and they're not actively using tags like journal request and PR request because they've already got a lot of the information that they need. They might be sent out to interview someone who's already lined up or something along those lines. And for bucket 1, for freelancers, I'd use a lot of Twitter. You can also like if you find a particular journalist, if you Google them and find that they're writing for a number of different publications, that's another great way to do it. You can use, there's a load of different websites that list journalists and they tell you the kind of publications that they work for. Again, you can kind of identify it from that. The media databases are pretty handy at giving you that information as well. And also just through correspondence with them. You'll be able to find in their email footer. And I think a big part of it is once you've spoken to that journalist, noting in your CRM or in your media list, wherever it is that you store all of those contacts, noting that information so everyone has it. And over time, you will start to understand where those people fall.
Yeah, that seems like such a big distinction that I feel like I haven't heard a lot of people talk about, kind of bucketing them into those three camps. I mean, is it like also title specific? Like editors versus reporters versus, I mean, like freelance journalists are obviously like easier to find, but like when you're building with a media list, do you look at specific or do you ignore specific titles for that reason as well?
I would steer more away from an editor because I feel like an editor's got a lot on their plate. So when someone reaches kind of editorial level, especially here in the UK, a lot of their work is amending and fact checking and kind of, proofreading, let's say, existing content. And therefore they don't often have a huge amount of time to do their own content or their own research. A lot of that goes into looking at what existing journalists have done. So yes, potentially I would stay away from that. I think reporter in general it's hugely broad because a reporter could be a general news reporter, or a reporter could be a property reporter, or a reporter could be someone that just covers, like for some publications here in the UK, we have reporters that just cover the royals and they just write about the royals 24/7. And that's what they do. And if you don't have anything that's related to that, then sending them a press release probably isn't going to get very far. So I wouldn't say there's anything specific in the title itself. I think, although it probably sounds like a really long-winded process, over time, you become familiar with where these people sit. And I think in the UK, we're fortunate because the majority of journalists here are freelance. So most of the bigger publications here in the UK would use freelance reporters across a lot of their content anyway.
Yeah, this makes me think I have to do a couple pieces on this. I feel like it would be really beneficial for people to know and understand some of these nuances that, you learn over time, right? But like also you learn from being there. And I'm sure it's different in the US. I mean, like I'm showing my gaps in my knowledge as well here. Like I've talked to more digital PRs in the UK, I feel like in the past year than I have in the US. And, my time pitching the US, again, like I mainly did it based on articles and like never used a media list. So, but I know there's plenty of people that use media lists. So like kind of knowing and understanding those nuances. So, okay, the pitches, let's get into a little bit of that because there is this idea, I think, of, knowing what to put in a pitch versus like having that sense for what is going to be most interesting. I've seen kind of the two approaches where most people will kind of put just like every bit of information they can, right? You end up kind of putting an entire post, right? Like if you do this kind of like content-led approach, maybe you have a piece of content on your client's blog or your own site somewhere, then you're pitching that. Like maybe it's a data study, the best cities for XYZ. Then you're pitching that to a journalist. Some PRs will actually cut and paste that whole article and put it right in the pitch. Is there such thing as too much information in a pitch is what I'm getting at here?
So the cut and paste thing is actually really frustrating for a lot of PRs. The reason being, here in the UK, a number of our major media outlets have an email defender software on. And when they cut and paste the content from the email into the story, the link doesn't go through to the website. It goes to the email defender software. Because what has happened is when the contents come in, it has automatically changed that link so that the person doesn't click on it and potentially go through to a, let's say, spammy website,
like spam or something.
to the email defense URL. And that's something that we've had like a lot of problems with in the last year. At first I was like, what is this like URL defense thing? And then I went and realized that a number of the publications here in the UK use it, like fair play to them, as you would, to stop people thinking externally. So we kind of want to discourage the copy and paste a bit, because you can end up with that. So, we've got some great coverage on publications, and then all of a sudden the link goes to that and it's like, no, what's going on? And then you're asking them to change it and they're just kind of like, no, or
Okay, so you're saying, sorry, just to clarify, you're saying the cut and paste, I would think it would be the other way around, right? Like you do want to cut and paste your entire article because then it's discouraging them from clicking that link. But you're saying the journalists will actually use that link and put it in their post, and it's a link to the email defender software, not the link to your actual.
Yeah. So what must happen, we've
Yeah.
figured, is that when we send the email to the journalist, when it comes to the journalist's inbox, rather than that link being to the client's website, that link changes to go through the email defender software. So then when they copy and paste that information into the article, that link again goes through the email defender software. And that's really frustrating. So one thing that we've been doing recently, well, I mean, we've done it for a while. We tend to use media packs. So what we'll do is on our emails, we'll do a kind of a pitch. We'll include, if there's like a table or a graphic or something that really stands out. So we'll do the pitch. We'll kind of give it a hook, the user intent angle, key like dot points of information, along with any key documented information. And then we'll link to an external file, which will be a media pack, usually on something like Google Drive, which will have any additional information, additional creative, a link to the data. So, where our data sets are, so they can have a look at that. And that means it's not crowded in the email. It's less likely to be caught as spam, but also they can then go in and have a look through that, pull out any information they need, hopefully create an article that doesn't then link through to that, the URL defense.
Yeah, I love that. So it's almost just a shorter article in that place too. You're not necessarily, I wonder, I don't know. And again, like this is a great idea for posts too. I need to get into this. I'm taking notes here. The idea of like, spam filters and like longer emails, do they get caught up in spam filters? I know personally right now with BuzzStream, like we're seeing, there's all of a sudden Microsoft like 365, anytime people use that email client or email provider, they, for whatever reason, the past like month or so, like their spam filtering has been really bad, and great, real emails are getting, and it's not just in the digital PR space, it's, personal emails, like people are saying all of a sudden, for whatever reason, they switch something and people are just having a lot of trouble with email, Microsoft 365 spam filtering. So yeah, I wonder how much of that gets into it, but that sounds like a great way to kind of get around some of that potential concern about like file size and email size. Is just use that Google link, Google Drive link, and put everything.
Google Drive is pretty friendly as well. And I mean, there's obviously other ways that you can do it too, but we've never really had a problem with it. And I would actually go as far as to say that the data campaigns in particular we've had most success with have been the ones that have had the media packs.
Yeah, love that. Okay, I want to get into, I guess, the biggest things here. I'm thinking, putting myself in the shoe of the journalist, right? And I'm sure you felt this right on the other side of things, but the overall sense, I think, from journalists is like, oh, not another SEO pitch, right? Like you can kind of tell, right? You hear this when I talk to journalists, when I've listened to interviews with journalists, it's like, oh, and now there's these agencies pitching on behalf of so-and-so. Tell me a little bit, just to give me a sense of what is the feeling towards kind of SEO in the journalism world, and how do you kind of navigate that with, given your journalism background, that, you work in an agency obviously now?
I mean, I think first the journalist has to know what SEO was, because to be fair, when I started out in journalism, I had no idea what it was. And when I was getting press releases that had kind of random information and links embedded in them, I was just a bit confused, if I'm being completely honest, because my journalism brain was saying like immediately, right, what's the human interest point of this? How many people are going to click on this article and how many people are going to read it? And that's the first thing that I'm thinking about. I'm not particularly thinking about like what the format of it is. I'm not particularly thinking about what the findings are. My first and foremost thought is, right, okay, I need to get clicks on this. I need to get people reading it. I need to get people engaging with it. How does it work from that perspective? And I think the most frustrating thing, again, from a journalist comes down to the relevance of the information. So, if I'm a journalist that's writing on the property round and I get, the 10 most beautiful beaches in the UK, I'm just going to be like, what? what is going on here? And it's going to be a source of frustration, because if I'm getting 300 emails a day and 20 of them are related to property and 280 of them are related to, the top 10 best skylines, cinemas, shopping centers, whatever the case might be, that's going to be really annoying, because I've got to actually sift through those emails to find the ones that I want. And it's also possible that within that I could miss the ones that I want. So I think there's definitely an element of frustration on the relevancy side of things, from being sent things that aren't relevant. And it really wouldn't surprise me if journalists just mark them off and just block them as spam. Because I do that. I do that, to be fair, in my work email. If someone sends me a lead generation email, they just get blocked straight away. I don't give them more than a second thought about it, because I don't have time for it. I don't want it clogging up my email. I've got enough emails going on as it is. And I think that approach is very similar for a journalist. And I think people, you have sort of one chance to make a first impression, right? You only have one chance. And if that first impression is that something isn't relevant, it's a very quick way to offside a journalist, or something that's annoying to them. And, we get emails that say, take me off this list, don't email me again, do not contact. And thankfully, we've got the ability, within our sort of mailing platforms to mark that with our CRM, so that we can make sure that we don't contact them again, because obviously we don't want to further kind of poke that situation. But it's definitely a problem. And I think SEO has made that a problem. And the rise of kind of digital PR has also made that an issue, because, 5 years ago, we were link building. We were emailing bloggers, and we were emailing, we weren't, because we haven't traditionally done link building. I'm saying in the industry as a whole, you're emailing bloggers, you're emailing guest posts, you were spinning articles into 200 different variations and posting them on God knows how many websites. We were harassing different people, basically. Now, and maybe in 5 years' time, we'll be hassling someone else. I don't know. But I think, when all of a sudden this kind of digital PR got coined as a buzzword, let's say, within the industry, and all of a sudden everyone's doing it. Everyone's sending out press releases. Even the websites and companies that are traditionally link buyers are now offering a digital PR service that's often unrelated to what, the particular.
Yeah, they're taking the wrong skill set into it. Yeah.
So the market is just incredibly, incredibly saturated. And, for journalists who are increasingly short of time, there's still increasing industries in the journalism, increasing redundancy, in the journalism market. I think it's easy to feel frustrated about it. But equally, on the flip side of that, if you find a PR that provides you with something that's genuinely useful, and we have a number of really good relationships with, in particular, we've got a client that's a garden center, got a client that's a personal finance provider, and journalists come to us now for that information, because they know that they can get the information from us. We've got an expert at hand, and we're just going to give them what they need. And I think that, the flip side of that is, if you can actually provide something that's valuable, and a journalist know they can come to you as a reliable source, then that is really valuable to them. So it's about focusing on establishing that as the first point of contact. Actually, how can we help you? How can we provide you with something that's genuinely valuable? And if you need any more support, let me know, because I know as a journalist, if I have someone, if I'm covering home and gardening, and I've got someone from a garden center that can talk to me about pretty much anything that's relevant to gardening, because, hey, they're a garden center, that's perfect, because I have an expert client now for all of my articles. So I think thinking about that from a PR perspective can help as well.
Yeah, I love that. I wrote down, just one of the first things you said was, just thinking about when you're pitching, thinking about the journalist and how many clicks, you said, how many people are going to actually click on this story, right? I feel like that, keeping that as your kind of guiding light feels like a really simple way to think about the whole process. And I want to get back to a very specific thing you said, though, getting back to the idea of a journalist who does rounds, right? So I feel like we come across this a lot. We're building, refining our tool all the time, BuzzStream and the prospecting. We're building a prospecting tool. And a lot of the mistakes I see people make are, I think this is what you're getting at. So say someone writes, you covered motorsports, right? But your focus was, what did you say? Not F1.
The VAC supercars.
The VAC Picard?
Supercars.
So supercars.
Yeah.
VAC Jean-Luc Picard. Okay, so supercars. So you're covering this very specific thing, but maybe on a media list, you show up as automotive or sports, right? So knowing kind of that you have to take that extra step to look at, I mean, I see this a lot where it's like, this person covers technology, but really you go in and it's a columnist who just has like, you know, technology today, and he only lists trending technology of the day. But you're trying to pitch him, a digital detox survey or something because you think, writes about technology. But I feel like that is a step that a lot of people don't take, is knowing. And so is that, when you say around, like a specific journalist that only has that very specific type of article, is that what a round is?
Yeah, I guess traditionally a round would maybe be a little bit more broad than that. So it would be like a
Okay.
property or government or, health and beauty, lifestyle, etc. So, traditionally within, particularly in publications that I've worked at, you might have someone that covers like all the government stories, and someone that covers anything related to property, and someone that covers anything related to health and beauty, and someone that covers anyone related to like famous people or the royals or something along those lines. So that would be a specific round. But you tend to find, particularly at national and regional newspapers, that those rounds are quite broad. I think where you would run into more of an issue with the niche is that very specific publication. So, for example, I was employed directly by the V8 Supercars. So for me, that is my only focus because I'm employed directly by that company as such. The same as maybe someone who was employed by Formula One, or someone who was, someone who's employed by, let's say, Buckingham Palace might only focus on the King and the Queen, not necessarily some of the royals that don't live there. So I think when we talk about journalists from a round perspective, what I'm referring to more so is the kind of national and regional publications where they have this slightly broader round.
Got it. And the only way you can really know that is if you look into what they've written, right?
Yeah, but you know what? I think that's a really big part of being a PR. And I think it's something that gets overlooked. And one thing that I would say is digital PR, I think in the last couple of years, has become a bit of a numbers game for a lot of people, but it never should have been that way. So, it's not a case of, how many emails can we send out and how many like links can we get. It should be about, understanding what the journalist wants, understanding what journalists are covering, sort of which areas. Like if you're a PR, I mean, at Cedarwood, normally our PRs will have maybe 3 clients each, potentially 4. So I would expect them with those clients to know those clients and the people that do those rounds, the people that work in the media and the journalists really, really well. I think when you run into an issue is when you have agencies where people are managing 30 clients or 40 clients per person,
Right.
and they've got absolutely no chance of getting to know. And that's just no disrespect to those agencies in any way, but I do think it's really difficult to get to know those journalists if you're working with such a broad range of topics. Whereas traditionally PR, and that probably is more link building, whereas traditionally PR is about building those relationships with the journalists because, maybe you're an in-house PR and you work with a particular brand and you're building that relationship, or even as an agency PR, you're working with 3 or 4 core clients and they know that they can come to you for that. And you're really familiar with who is covering, that content in that space. And I think as a PR, part of the job is knowing that. And that's really important.
Would a journalist, in your opinion, get upset with you if you ask them what types of stories they prefer? Like in the off-cast case that you do get through to a journalist who, your pitch, say the thing that stuck out to me was like, say someone's in a property round, you said, but then you sent them like something on the best hotels in that same area that they work in, but like it's not necessarily property related. If they do reject it instead of just, ignoring your email completely, do you ever recommend people just saying like, oh, sorry, what kind of stories would you prefer in the future? I remember personally doing that for mainly when people would cover things for me, especially like a freelancer. You'd just be like, what are your ideal kind of stories? And I'll keep you in mind. And then you would just like build this little Rolodex on the side where you have kind of those tricks and tips for how to pitch a certain person. But I mean, is that something that would be off-putting for a journalist?
I mean, I think you can definitely ask the question. If I was a journalist and I was receiving that kind of email, if I had the time to respond to it and I felt that it was worth that, I would definitely respond to it. I don't know if you necessarily will get a response because, again, I think the journalists are just so inundated with emails that chances are
Yeah.
something that's been sent to them probably is super relevant to what they're looking to do that day. And I think if they're, again, you're creating a lot of back and forth. And I think traditionally for journalists and PR, the back and forth is a good thing. But whether it's what's actually happening in this day and age, I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah. I feel like you're right. Like the example I was giving was maybe when I first started. So that's like 7, 8 years ago. And I feel like maybe journalists, and it was some of those sites what you don't really necessarily see as much around, where it was, we called them just like fun sites, where it was just like they cover fun kind of pop culture stuff, and just like the really creative hero campaigns and stuff that you don't necessarily see a lot of. Yeah, maybe those types of journalists, they also probably don't have as much time, but they probably don't really exist. A lot of those sites don't exist anymore. Okay, last thing to kind of put a bow on this, I want to get your thought on where you think things are moving with journalism, relationship building, given, again, your background as a journalist. Where are things moving, and how can digital PRs kind of take advantage of this and succeed, given everything you know?
I think digital PRs and journalists need to connect more offline. I think that that's something that's been lost a lot since COVID. I think it's been lost in general across all industries, across all sectors. We see it even at client meetings. People don't necessarily want to meet face to face. They want to, meet online. I do a lot of virtual coffees with people. It's kind of weird, but it works. I mean, I don't drink coffee. I sit here with like a water, but that's how it is. But I think, there's a lot of journalists actually that are out there on Twitter saying, I'm in London today. If you're around, give me a bell. Let's catch up for half an hour. I think if you are a PR and you're in a particular space, say you've got those 3 or 4 clients and some of them are in specific verticals and they're long-term clients and you want to invest in that relationship, I would definitely encourage you to take the journalist for a coffee. I don't think there's any harm in doing that. Why not get out there? Why not get to know them? Maybe go to some networking events, put yourself out there, familiarize yourself. I think that the people that will do the best are the people that form those in-person relationships because, it's cutting through the noise, isn't it? So for example, we host a digital marketing meetup every 2 months called Manchester DM. And at the end of the last one, I had a number of people come up to me saying that they wanted to get into digital marketing, but they were struggling to break through the noise because they're sending in applications. We're getting like 700 applications for every job that we put out. And it's really, really hard to sift our way through those CVs. But it's an awful lot easier if we've met those people and we've had a chat to them and we can put a name to a face. And I think it's the same with journalists and PRs. Again, they're getting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails every day from essentially like faceless people because they don't know who these people are. But if they've met that person or they have some familiarity, some awareness with them at a networking event, or potentially they've even seen them in an online webinar or seminar, they can actually put a name and a personality and a face to that person. I think it's a lot easier for them to open that dialogue and open that conversation and have that. So I think that's going to be like a big part of it. I think that's definitely something that's important moving forward. I think it used to be more of a cornerstone in terms of what was going on. I don't think it's necessarily so much that anymore. And I still think there's going to be an element moving forward of this practical exchange. I think journalists are going to become increasingly squeezed. I think that there's still going to be more challenges in that space. And I've even seen publications now that are asking PRs to upload their press releases. And they're basically going through and saying yes, no, yes, no. And those ones that they're approving, they're just putting straight on the website and they're almost cutting the journalist out altogether. So basically the PR is writing the story and they're putting it onto the website. And I mean, that to me is hugely concerning because, the whole thing that I learned when I was a journalist was about how to be unbiased, how to be, as a journalist, you should be offering an objective view on something. And I think a lot of the times PR are probably not going to be 100% objective because they've got a product or service or something that they want to push, right? Like fair play to them. But that's what journalists are there for. Journalists are the gatekeepers of news. And taking them out is difficult. But, some places have decided to do that to cut costs, whatever the case might be. So that element's going to come in and that's going to be challenging because we're going to have to work out how we're going to deal with that. And, as an industry to make sure that we're fact checking information, to make sure there's no, the rise of fake news is a disaster. Like we have to get a grip on that for a start. And that kind of platform is not helping that in any way, shape or form. And I just really think that it's going to be about the relationships. And I think it should be because at the end of the day, that's PR and journalism always had that, right? Like they always had, even though they sat on technically different sides, they always had that connected relationship. And when they work together, that's when the best kind of content is created, because the PR is able to provide that expertise and that insight that the journalist needs to create a really good story. So I hope that as a kind of industry, that's where we go. I hope that we work together in a more connected space. But in order to do that, we have to get out, talk to people more.
Yeah, love it. That's a fantastic way to end this. I think, Amanda, I want to really thank you for your time here and your insight. You can catch Amanda Walls on LinkedIn primarily, I'd say, but it sounds like you spend a lot of time on Twitter, or X. Maybe you'll see her on Blue Sky. We talked about that earlier today. I just got on Blue Sky. We'll see where that takes us. Cedarwood Digital, you can find them online. Check out all the great stuff they're doing. Reminder again, like, subscribe, share this stuff. If you have any questions for Amanda, feel free to, comment on the social posts we'll do about this, but also YouTube video. I'm sure Amanda will be happy to answer any questions. So thanks again, Amanda.
Thanks, Vince.
I want to leave people with this last little tidbit here. Remember when you're pitching to think about, put yourself in the journalist's shoes. How many people are going to actually click on this story that you're pitching? I really love that. I feel like that's a great way to, a great little tidbit to remember when you're doing the pitches. So thanks again, Amanda, and thanks everyone for watching.